This episode of LegalEagle was made possible by Skillshare. Learn to think like a lawyer for free for 2 months by clicking on the link in the description. In the last few weeks, we've seen defenders of this administration go from there was absolutely no quid pro quo,
there was no conditionality there was no quid pro quo there,
to it would only be a quid pro quo if President Trump were really thuggish about it.
Graham was asked what he thought would constitute inappropriate quid pro quo, saying, hey pal, you know, you need to go after the Bidens or I ain't gonna give you any money. He'd be really thuggish about it.
To quid pro quos happen all the time, and in fact, they're actually really good.
What you just described is a quid pro quo. It is funding will not flow unless the investigation into the Democratic server happened as well.
We do that all the time with foreign policy.
So what's the deal with quid pro quos? Impeachable offense or routine diplomacy tool? Hey Legal Eagles, it's time to think like a lawyer. You all took Latin in high school, right? Everyone knows the legal definition of quid pro quo and we can just all go home, right? No? You want me to talk about why this is all relevant? Okay, fine. On October 22nd, Bill Taylor, the top diplomat or chargé d'affaires to Ukraine, testified behind closed doors before the House committees that are leading the impeachment inquiry of Donald Trump. Taylor's full testimony is currently unknown, but news agencies got a hold of Taylor's opening statement. Now, this was just Taylor's opening statement, but what he revealed in it basically stunned everyone that's paying attention. Taylor, you might recall, was one of the diplomats who was a party to a WhatsApp conversation with U.S. Special Envoy Kurt Volker and U.S. Ambassador to the EU, Gordon Sondland. Volker turned over the transcripts of those texts to the House committees. Taylor famously texted on September 9th, as I said on the phone, I think it's crazy to withhold security assistance for help with a political campaign. To which Gordon Sondland replied 5 hours later, Bill, I believe you are incorrect about President Trump's intentions. The president has been crystal clear, no quid pro quos of any kind. The president is trying to evaluate whether Ukraine is truly going to adopt the transparency reforms that President Zelensky promised during his campaign. I suggest we stop the back and forth by text. If you still have concerns, I recommend you give Lisa Kenna or S a call to discuss them directly. Thanks. Taylor was asked to testify as a witness to the investigation into the Trump administration's efforts to pressure Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky into opening an investigation into repudiated allegations of Ukraine's interference in the 2016 US presidential elections, as well into the company Burisma for the purpose of eliciting or fabricating dirt on Hunter Biden and by proxy Joe Biden, political candidate for President of the United States. Taylor began his opening statement by emphasizing the importance of the United States' relationship with Ukraine, saying, our national security demands that this relationship remain strong. Taylor went on to say more about this, noting that Ukraine now and for the last 5 years has been under attack from Russia, and that the United States security assistance is crucial to Ukraine's defense against Russia, and that withholding security assistance would be, quote, crazy. And crazy is exactly what Taylor would soon discover on the part of the Trump administration. In June, Taylor delivered a letter from President Trump to President Zelensky congratulating him on his election victory and inviting him to a meeting at the Oval Office. This meeting was an apparent goal for Zelensky, but in order to obtain this goal, Zelensky had to do some things for Trump first. For example, in a planned June 28th call with the Ukrainian president, Ambassador Sondland, quote, did not wish to include most of the regular interagency participants, and, quote, said that he wanted to make sure no one was transcribing or monitoring as they added President Zelensky to the call. Taylor noted that a short time later, it became abundantly clear to him that, quote, the meeting President Zelensky wanted was conditioned on the investigations of Burisma and alleged Ukrainian interference in the 2016 US elections, and that this, quote, irregular policy channel was guided by Rudy Giuliani. On July 18th, Taylor learned from an individual at the Office of Management and Budget, the OMB, that there was a hold on security assistance to Ukraine. This individual could not explain why there was a hold, but Taylor had a pretty good idea. When Taylor inquired further, the individual told him that her boss had, quote, instructed her not to approve any additional spending of security assistance for Ukraine until further notice. This unidentified individual also relayed that the directive for the hold had come directly from President Trump through Mick Mulvaney to the OMB's chief of staff. This is very, very bad, and we'll talk about in a moment this is strong evidence for a quid pro quo. In his statement, Taylor went on to emphasize how important US aid to Ukraine was and how many more lives could be lost if the hold remained. He also noted that the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, the CIA Director, and the National Security Advisor all tried to sit down with President Trump and convince him to release the hold. This sit-down, however, was, quote, hard to schedule. What President Trump wanted, Taylor discovered, was for Zelensky to, quote, say that he will help the investigation and address any specific personnel issues if there are any. Trump's administration wanted Zelensky to publicly announce his participation in this investigation, and they even tried to give Zelensky a script of what to say to Trump, suggesting that he announced that, quote, I will leave no stone unturned with regard to, quote, investigations, all the while making it look like the US was uninvolved. Zelensky's response, according to Taylor, to all of this was that he did not want to, quote, be used as a pawn in a US re-election scheme. This testimony paints a picture of the Trump administration's motivations. By withholding US aid, they hope to get Zelensky to announce his investigation into Joe Biden's son in the hopes that it would bolster Trump's re-election campaign. At this point, the clock was ticking with regard to security assistance to Ukraine. Because of the way the US budget works, if the funds weren't released by the end of September, they would essentially expire and disappear. Not to mention the actual Ukrainians whose lives were at stake. In the last 5 years, 13,000 Ukrainians have been killed by Russian soldiers, and potentially dozens of Ukrainian civilians had been killed by Russia during this time period. Taylor was worried, especially because, quote, if the White House did not lift the hold prior to the end of the fiscal year, September 30th, the funds would expire and Ukraine would receive nothing. As the wait went on, Ambassador Sondland explicitly stated that, quote, the security assistance money would not come until President Zelensky committed to pursue the Burisma investigation. Taylor's fears were confirmed. This was the first time that he had heard that security assistance, not just a White House Oval Office meeting, was conditioned on Zelensky committing to investigating Burisma. The bottom line is that Taylor testified that, one, there was in fact a quid pro quo. The White House conditioned the release of $400 million of military aid on Ukraine's statement that they were opening investigation into Burisma. Number two, the order to withhold aid came from the president himself. Number three, this was never about corruption. It was about getting dirt on Joe Biden and his son. And number four, the White House tried to hide their involvement by scripting Ukraine's announcement and pretending that the investigations had been Ukraine's idea all along. It's of course always important to take a step back and look at the various players. Everyone has bias, and it's important to recognize when you have two conflicting accounts. Taylor is a career diplomat who served in both Republican and Democratic administrations. So could he be too close to Ukraine? Of course. Interestingly, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo specifically asked Taylor to essentially come out of retirement to help with the situation. Taylor was essentially President Trump's pick to run diplomacy with Ukraine. Taylor acknowledged his own bias in stating that he wanted the US to support Ukraine and conditioned his coming out of retirement on that very fact. On the other side of the coin, there is Gordon Sondland, who is a hotelier who donated $1 million to Trump's inauguration. Allegedly, when Gordon Sondland testified behind closed doors, he did not recall most of what Bill Taylor testified to, although he doesn't appear to outright contradict anything that Bill Taylor actually said. Taylor allegedly took contemporaneous notes throughout the affair. In addition to Bill Taylor's testimony, Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, an Army officer assigned to the National Security Council, also testified recently. He was one of the members of the NSC that listened to the infamous July 25th call from the Situation Room. According to his opening statement, Vindman largely confirmed the account of the whistleblower and the readout that has already been made public, and which I covered in an earlier video. Vindman testified in his opening statement that he was, quote, concerned by the call, stating, I did not think it was proper to demand that a foreign government investigate a US citizen, and I was worried about the implications for the US government's support of Ukraine. I realized that if Ukraine pursued an investigation into the Bidens and Burisma, it would likely be interpreted as a partisan play which would undoubtedly result in Ukraine losing the bipartisan support it had thus far maintained. This would all undermine US national security. Following the call, I again reported my concerns to the NSC's lead counsel. The New York Times is also reporting that Vindman stated in his deposition, which lasted 10.5 hours, and that's quite a long time, that he requested several changes to the wording of the readout of the call, but that those changes were rejected by the White House for unknown reasons. Vindman also testified about an earlier July 10th call with Alexander Daniluk, the Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council for Ukraine, and National Security Advisor Bolton, Ambassadors Volker and Sondland, and Energy Secretary Rick Perry. Vindman testified that during this July 10th call, the meeting proceeded well until Ukrainians broached the subject of a meeting between the two presidents. Ambassador Sondland started to speak about delivering specific investigations in order to secure the meeting with the president, at which time Ambassador Bolton cut the meeting short. Following this meeting, there was a scheduled debriefing during which Ambassador Sondland emphasized the importance that Ukraine deliver the investigations into the 2016 election, the Bidens, and Burisma. I stated to Ambassador Sondland that his statements were inappropriate, that the request to investigate Biden and his son had nothing to do with national security, and that such investigations were not something the NSC was going to get involved in or push. Dr. Hill then entered the room and asserted to Ambassador Sondland that his statements were inappropriate. Following the debriefing meeting, I reported my concerns to the NSC's lead counsel. Dr. Hill also reported the incident to the NSC's lead counsel. So in general, Lieutenant Colonel Vindman's testimony backs up Bill Taylor's and refutes the testimony of Ambassador Gordon Sondland. Additionally, there have been attacks from the right against Lieutenant Colonel Vindman for his status as a Ukrainian immigrant and allegations of dual loyalty, despite the fact that he's a U.S. citizen and longtime member of the Army. It's not clear that these attacks or criticisms are based on anything more than speculation. So that brings us to the quid pro quo. Now, of course, in the famous Sondland text, Sondland relayed that the president has been crystal clear that no quid pro quos of any kind. But just because they claim that doesn't necessarily mean that it wasn't a quid pro quo arrangement. As Taylor himself said in response to this contention, quote, President Trump did insist that President Zelensky go to a microphone and say he is opening investigations of Burisma and 2016 election interference, and that President Zelensky should want to do this himself. Quid pro quo translates literally to this for that. It is a type of exchange where someone on one side gives a thing of value to someone else and expects something in return from that person. Whether a quid pro quo is illegal and illicit depends on the context. If I give you $5 and you give me a book, that's a quid pro quo, and there's nothing wrong with that. But things take a turn when you're talking about government officials using the power of their office to extract a personal benefit. Oftentimes, a quid pro quo emerges in a governmental setting when a government official receives something of personal value and then abuses his or her official power to give something in return to that specific constituent who gave some personal benefit to that government official. You can imagine a government contractor who gives a fancy new sports car to a government official who then steers a valuable governmental contract to that contractor. That is a classic quid pro quo. Illegal quid pro quo arrangements also tend to pop up in a workplace setting. A quid pro quo would exist where an employer demands sexual favors in return for an employee keeping their job. So it depends on the context. Mick Mulvaney has recently been emphasizing that, especially in foreign policy settings, quid pro quo arrangements happen all the time. That's just the nature of foreign policy.
We do that all the time with foreign policy.
I'll help you do this if you help me do that. Everyone is happy and secure. For example, throughout the history of the United States, we have used our own aid or assistance as leverage for achieving things such as democracy abroad, an end to corruption, and even physical access to important geographical areas. For example, President Jimmy Carter provided Egypt with aid in exchange for Egypt making peace with Israel. President Bush even demanded that countries provide free speech and freedom of assembly before receiving certain US aid. However, while this may be true, quid pro quos that involve a concerted self-interest for a particular politician do not happen all the time in foreign policy. And quite frankly, they really don't happen at all. In fact, it was such a stunning admission by Mick Mulvaney to admit that this was a quid pro quo on behalf of the Trump administration, ostensibly for President Trump, that it elicited an almost immediate walkback from Mulvaney and the rest of the administration. This arrangement between the Trump administration and President Zelensky of Ukraine falls into the problematic category of quid pro quos for a couple of reasons. First of all, such an arrangement is probably highly illegal and may be sufficient to prove the crimes of bribery and election interference. While it would be admittedly difficult to indict and convict a president of these crimes for reasons that we've already talked about on this channel, in order to establish a prima facie case for bribery under 18 U.S.C. 201, one would have to prove that a public official, in this case President Trump, directly or indirectly corruptly demanded anything of value personally, in this case bolstering his re-election campaign, in return for being influenced in the performance of any official act, in this case releasing money that Congress and the Pentagon had already appropriated for Ukraine. Or you can take, for example, 51 U.S.C. 30121, which states that it shall be unlawful for a foreign national directly or indirectly to make a contribution or donation of money or other thing of value, or to make an express or implied promise to make a contribution or donation in connection with a federal, state, or local election. In this case, one would argue that the thing of value is investigating a political rival, which obviously the Trump administration would try to lord over the head of Joe Biden as he tries to secure the Democratic nomination for potentially running for president of the United States in 2020. Additionally, and apart from whether any of these acts fit the neat statutory definitions of these crimes and overcome the constitutional issues in terms of indicting a sitting president, this arrangement is problematic because it essentially means that the President of the United States is subverting the national interest for his own personal interest. In other words, he's putting himself above the entire country. Now, no one argues that Hunter Biden's status as a board member of Burisma doesn't smack of nepotism, but strong-arming a sovereign nation into investigating a conspiracy theory about Ukrainian computer servers and ginning up a defunct investigation into Burisma appears to serve President Trump only and not U.S. national interest. It appears motivated primarily, if not solely, to help President Trump get reelected and not to help America. Rudy Giuliani tweets the quiet part out loud when he tweeted, "With all the fake news, let me make it clear that everything I did was to discover evidence to defend my client against false charges. Dems would be horrified by the attacks on me if my client was a terrorist, but they don't believe real Donald Trump has rights." The problem here is that at the request of the president, Rudy Giuliani was running his own shadow foreign policy operation. And he's admitting that in this context, he wasn't acting on behalf of America, but acting on behalf of his client, Donald Trump, in trying to get dirt against a political rival. If this had been in America's interest, President Trump would have used the usual diplomatic channels, gone through the Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty, and avoided using an entirely separate clandestine shadow foreign policy team led by Rudy Giuliani. This kind of arrangement pressuring Ukraine to do something to benefit President Trump personally in exchange for $400 million in U.S. aid and assistance is what appears to be an abuse of power and an attempt to use one's official capacity as president for personal gain. Now, some, including former acting Attorney General Matthew Whitaker, have argued that an abuse of power is not a crime.
What evidence of a crime do you have? I mean, the Constitution, sort of abuse of power is not a crime. The Constitution is very clear that this has to be some pretty egregious behavior.
However, such an abuse of power is a crucial inquiry as far as impeachment is concerned. That's because impeachment was designed to dismantle this kind of abuse of power. Ironically, Bill Taylor came out of retirement at the request of Mike Pompeo to help Ukraine. Now he'll probably want to go back into retirement. And now that he has more time on his hands, maybe he'll finally listen to his grandkids and join Instagram after taking Brandon Wolfel's class, Instagram-worthy photography, shoot, edit, and share. Or maybe he will finally tackle all those chores around the house his wife asked him to do, like redesigning his family room. He could really use Emily Henderson's Skillshare class, Style Your Space, Creative Tips and Techniques for Interior Design. Skillshare is an online learning community that has tens of thousands of classes on everything, like music, design, lifestyle, and technology. It's great for former top diplomats who suddenly find themselves with a lot more time on their hands. A yearly membership is less than $10 per month, but Legal Eagles will get 2 free months of Skillshare when you click on the link below. Plus, it really helps out this channel. The free premium membership gives you unlimited access to must-know topics so you can improve your skills and learn new things, all free for 2 months. So improve yourself now while you're waiting to give your own congressional testimony before the House impeachment inquiry. Do you agree with my analysis? Leave your objections in the comments, and check out my other real law reviews over here where I talk about the whistleblower, hearsay objections to the impeachment inquiry, and tons of other breaking news. And as always, I will see you in court.